I'm Elias Stahl, the co-founder and CEO of Hilos, and I'm here talking with Mike Friton, one of the most innovative shoemakers in the world, responsible for over 20 of Nike's best-selling patents and designs, including the Presto and the Fly East. Friton worked with Bill Bowerman from the very early days of the company and over 16 of the brand's most innovative years. Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
So you're more than just a shoemaker. You're an anthropologist. How do the two relate in your work together? I should say you studied anthropology. You're not an anthropologist, but you studied anthropology, and I think it's informed a large part of your craft. How do the two relate together?
Well, I studied cultural anthropology, which is just kind of distinguishes itself separate from there's other types of anthropology. But in cultural anthropology, we look a lot at the craft and the garments and all the artifacts, and then try to interpret what cultural significance and meaning. And in doing that, I especially around textiles, I looked at different weave structures and whether they're woven or braided or knit. And then also looking at ways of manipulating fibers, to create 3D forms. So that really helped me a lot as I went into shoemaking, because shoemaking is about manipulating flat goods into 3D form. So my connection to anthropology really helped. Also, I spent a lot of times in museums wherever I travel around the world, and I always go towards the old artifacts. It's just a kind of inherent in me. I think even as a child, I looked at things like that. My grandmother had a whole collection of National Geographics, and every time I was with her, I was always buried in those books.
Yeah,
looking at things.
I love those books.
Yeah, and so I go into museums and I look at older shoes and all these older craft and how they were made, and I sort of imagine people making them. And so, if you look at older artifacts, sometimes you see them as like, even like the original Bowerman shoes. The ones that they show, they're all compressed and flattened and partially decomposed.
Yeah.
But it's imagining what they were like originally, and that's what I think really is intriguing, and it gives you a different perspective. And also, there's a lot of craft that was basically lost during the Industrial Revolution, where goods became cheaper. There's basic simple goods, but all the complex goods that were kind of left behind. So a lot of the complex structures in that world are relevant today. You can bring those things forward and sort of reintroduce them in new ways with new materials. So that's what draws me to that.
So that's an interesting point. What element of craft was lost in industrialization, and how can it be brought back?
Well, I think in any craft, it's a complexity. You look at the technique and the complexity of what they were doing, thousands of years ago, and it's amazing. It's a lot of things machines can't even do today.
Yeah.
And, because they're all done by hand, and it's like time wasn't an issue almost. But I'm sure it was, but not to the degree it is today, where they had a lot of time that they put into individual things, and they were more valuable because. That back then there wasn't industrial machines to pump out really cheap commodity goods that make everything so inexpensive. So everybody, if you wanted even a scarf or something, somebody had to make it by hand, and it had a higher value than today, where machines pump them out, they're a dime a dozen. So
yeah, well, how has craftsmanship been infused in products today that aren't mass manufactured, or how has that informed your work in trying to bring craftsmanship back to footwear?
Well, one of the good examples of my Nike years was the Nike woven shoes. I was the first one to go to Mexico and buy shoes in the marketplace, and then learn how they were made, and then I brought that back to Nike. And I did that. I was inspired by another designer, Mike Friton, who was experimenting with interweaving strips of material. And I told him, they do that left and right all over the place down in Mexico. And he goes, well, go down and find out how they do it. So that's what I did. I brought the techniques back, with the help of Tina Casillas, another pattern engineer. And I still make those shoes today. You know, that's part of my teaching because it's a really good technique I can show somebody in a few hours how to, craft a shoe together. And it takes much longer to be good at it, but the basic technique only takes a few hours.
Yeah. I mean, I like that. I think there's value clearly in what took centuries to develop and is a very powerful way of making a good. And there's, in early days of industrialization, a wholesale rejection of that. And probably a feeling of we can now do better because we possess things no one else had the luxury of possessing. We have steam power, we have electrification, we can remake the world in its image. And there's a lot that's lost when we do that. And there's a recognition or a growing recognition today that things are much more poorly made and ultimately less satisfying as a result.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily more poorly made today. There's just a different approach. Some things can be you can use the techniques and tools today to do really good quality stuff.
Yeah.
So it's not a matter of dumbing down or making things cheaper. It's just how you use the tools.
Like a fusion. You advocated more of a fusion approach of using new tools as well as old craft to create something better than both.
Yeah, and you're looking back for inspiration. There's a lot of things that were left behind that, you just bring them forward, like the woven shoes.
Yeah.
Basically Hirachi sort of style. They're sort of old. You think of those as sort of older styles, made out of leather down in Mexico or other parts of the world. But again, you use different materials, modern materials, a little bit of different twist on the design line, because the flexibility of the design line with woven stuff is amazing. But there's a lot of different just options. It's just adding to the palette of things you can do.
Well, what are shoemakers getting wrong today?
Well, the shoemaker is kind of a loaded word for me.
Yeah.
People sometimes call me a shoemaker. I don't really consider myself a true shoemaker. I make shoes, but I don't do that all day. I'm designing and innovating and approaching a lot of different aspects of what's involved. And you go into like at Nike, there isn't anybody. There are a few people that know how to actually make the product like all by themselves. Mm-hmm. But most of that world in Nike or Adidas or whatever, it's all designers and developers and marketing people. They're basically marketing companies more than shoemaking companies, because all their product is made in factories in Asia. So all the shoemakers are in Asia. No, they're not at these companies. Not all of them. I mean, there are a few. Like I was an exception to the rule in the making part. But
you just called yourself a shoemaker there. I might have caught you.
But it's just a small part of what I do.
Yeah, you're influencing and growing the art of shoemaking, but you're not cranking out a line of shoes all day, every day. But when we outsourced that in the 70s, we began losing that craft and the historical memory of that craft and moved to Asia, right?
It's well in some respects, but not. I wouldn't say you're losing it. It's just a different approach. And in Asia, they're not really. I think of a shoemaker as somebody that it's almost like a cobbler that has a shop where they're making older style shoes, bespoke type stuff. They're doing that all day. That's their focus. My focus, I think of weaving. You call me a weaver. I braid. On a Japanese braiding table. Call me a braider. You could call me. I do origami. I call me a origami master or whatever. But I'm not really a master. But I do explore a lot of interesting side techniques in origami. But I bring all those to the table. I've never really called myself. If I'm not, or I was never really labeled technically a designer, but I do. Especially since I left Nike, I do more what I would call design, where I'm actually drawing and using that to represent what I do instead of make. While I was at Nike, I didn't bother taking time to draw anything. I just made stuff because by the time I drew it, I could make it.
That's an important lesson. That's probably one that we could all be learning from.
Yeah.
Make something. Don't just envision it and then pass it off to someone else. To truly understand it, try and make it yourself.
Yeah. So it's hard to peg me into one little niche. I'm all kind of all over. But also here in America, the designers have high esteem within the companies. In Asia, it's just the opposite. Like designers are at kind of at a lower part of they're like the lower echelon of the company. That's not true of all of them, but I mean, it's really different, kind of opposite. Like the factories tell the designers what to do in Asia. Mm-hmm. That's what I've learned working with some of the companies there, where here the designers tell the factory what to do. But they have more power and more clout, I've had a hard time with that when I was working in Nike, because I thought, you shouldn't put designers so high on a pedestal. It really, I think, gets in the way of adding value to what everybody else is doing. There should be more of a trying to level the playing field instead of elevating one group over another. But that's not at all what, in the bigger companies, it's, you're a designer, you're like the top of the heap, and it's just like,
yeah,
come on, you're not making anything, you're just drawing pictures.
Well, there's something to, I mean, you're talking about, it's hard to place you in a peg, and I think there's something to designing, developing, and making in one body, in one team, in one process, because you're able to leverage all these other different forms of making, from your weaving, from your origami. You're able to infuse that into your design and then to scale it for manufacturing. I think that's a really valuable, I agree, there's not enough of that happening today. When you silo, it doesn't matter who's on top. Designing and development should happen together.
Right. And a good example of what at least from what I've read, I've worked with Gore-Tex a little bit, but they have more of a level playing field, where they call everybody an associate. There aren't these labels that put one person above another. Although inside, I think there's a hierarchy, but obviously they have managers and people that lead. But it's just that idea of having a more level playing field. And I think that opens up a lot more. I think that opens the window more to innovation or more input from people, whoever you are. You can even give input to the team.
Yeah. Well, one of the things one important lesson that you taught me, and I think infuses everything that you do, is if you want to look forward with shoemaking, you really have to look back. You have to go back to the craft, to a diversity of craft from across the world and cultures, and use that to infuse your design in different ways of making for a post-industrial future.
Yeah. Well, if you look at like in the, again, going back to my experience at Nike, there was sort of a path that you normally follow to create a shoe.
Yeah.
And they want to create this sort of digital path, basically, that everybody follows. So it's for consistency and a lot of other things throughout the ease of running the company. But the reality is, if you look, especially going back and looking at all these older techniques and stuff, there's a whole spectrum of ways. There's a huge variety in ways you can make shoes.
Yeah. It doesn't follow that neat pattern.
Shutting all that out and just like getting tunnel vision in how this is the path on how you make a shoe. This is how or even getting down to the parts, what you call the parts, and all the little niche things within that world. It's just like you're not really seeing the bigger picture of what the possibilities are. And so I went and learned how to make cowboy boots 20 years ago, because I just wanted to learn the technique. And the guy that taught me was a master bootmaker. His boots are in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. He said, well, he was telling me these are the best shoes, best things for you. Everybody should be wearing cowboy boots. And I go, I kind of thought, well, I don't think I'd want to run a marathon in these. So to me, it's a different perspective. For me, it's always about, again, another part of my world is I get back to, I want to make things that are healthy and things that are that fit the foot properly in a way. But then it's not a static fit. And that's the problem with a lot of shoemakers. They think, well, if I have this perfect last, the form that you build shoes on, I'll have the perfect fit. That's not true. The foot is dynamic. every position you put your foot in, the shape changes.
Yeah.
The width changes. There are all kinds of things change within, how the foot aligns and stuff. So thinking that you can create a static form to create the perfect fit is ridiculous. It's more like, even going back to what in like a Native American moccasins, I think are some of the best sort of types of footwear for the free mobility of the foot. In our society, though, we've really crippled a lot of feet by wearing shoes. So then you think you need more support and more of stuff, but it's, to me, that's more related to the fact that we've crippled our feet by wearing shoes that are not proper for allowing the foot to develop naturally.
So there's the school of thought that's the barefoot school, really creating the foot itself as an organic tool that blends with its surrounding, and then creating a package that supports the foot where it's weak, and having inserts. And if you have if you're flat footed like me, then you have the arches to support your foot. And if you have a high pronation, you want to counter that. So where do you land in that spectrum?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you wear support, if you have to support your foot with stuff, and a lot of times people say, well, I need more support. And I go, well, when you go home and take off your shoes, do you feel like you need support when you're walking around the house? They go, no. You don't want to have the shoes on, because the shoes they're not dynamic. They don't move with the foot properly. So even pronation, I mean, your heel naturally splays to the medial side when you walk and run. It doesn't when you stand. And that's usually where they measure your foot.
Yeah.
So then I think, well, when you walk and run, you're pronating, because it's actually, if you look at the heel, it pivots a little bit to the medial side, to the inside. And then you're falling off basically the platform that you're trying to stand on, because it's not designed to follow your foot. And then think, well, I pronate, I need a special whatever support, orthotics or support. And it's like, well, yeah, if you want to wear that platform, you need that extra support to hold you onto that platform, but that platform is really not healthy for your foot because it's not following your foot. So, and eventually you wear those orthotics and those support systems, and it's like wearing a cast on your arm. You take that cast off and your arm is super weak.
Yeah.
So you put that cast on you put those little supportive cast devices on your feet, they're going to get weaker. And all the muscles around that are going to get weaker. And then you take it off and you feel like, oh man, I need that support because it's weak. But if you take a cast off, first thing the doctor tells you is go to rehab, get the strength back in your arm so you can function normally. They don't do that with your feet. They say, put orthotics on and wear them the rest of your life. It's like, if I break my arm and I wear a cast for the rest of my life. That makes sense.
But that kind of dependence.
It's a huge industry though, and a lot of money for people. But that doesn't make sense.
Well, so the perfect shoe for our feet would be something that is minimal, that really allows the foot to be dynamic,
right,
and with minimal interference between the foot and any surface.
Well, it allows the foot to move naturally.
Yeah.
And even like if you take rubber and foam, they bend, but they don't. You try to stretch them or move them, in the lateral motion, they won't do it. They're rigid. But there are foams and rubber out there that you can get that do stretch and would move like that, but we don't use those in footwear. And a lot of that, I think, I attribute to the tire and the automotive industry, because that's, we basically build shoes that sort of mimic what tires are. And that's, of course, not even close to anything natural or biomechanical for the human body.
Well, let's talk about sustainability. I want to get you a little fired up here. What is the industry getting wrong, and what's your solution? We know that this is a really wasteful. Fashion retail is the fourth most polluting industry in the world. We know that there's a huge amount of water pollution and chemical waste. What are they getting wrong?
Well, they're drinking their own Kool-Aid. They think that they say we're sustainability, and then they think, oh, we're doing something sustainable because we say it's recyclable. And well, what does recyclable mean? Look at the facts. They say, oh, we're picking up trash on the beach and making that into shoes. Well, how much energy did you put into picking up that trash and moving it back to a factory to recreate a product?
Yeah.
You wasted a lot more energy than you did if you would have just took raw material to make it. So this all hyped up about all this sustainability stuff, and it's even when you recycle plastics, especially the types you use in footwear, you can use a small percentage of that recycled material in the batch. You can't do 100%. It's like, if you get over like sometimes 30, 40%, it degrades. It's not, you can't use it. So you can't go one-to-one recycle, and you can't, and usually that's just a one-time deal, because those plastics break down that process. And plus any kind of oils or sunlight, even oxygen, starts to degrade the quality of the plastics. And foam and rubber and all that's plastic. Even some of the synthetic leathers, or even leather itself that's coated, has sort of plastic materials in it. So you can't. They're drinking their own Kool-Aid when they're saying we're really making things cleaner. They're not. They may be delaying a small percentage of that getting to the landfill in one step, so it takes a little bit longer to get there, but it still gets there. So the only true, I think, sustainable path, and it's what was done for thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution, is biodegradable. All shoes were biodegradable up until plastics were introduced. So and a lot of those materials are still available. Of course, we could still make shoes out of those. Felt and leather and some of the rubber materials. Even plant fiber, including cotton and stuff, if it's done right. But and you see a small segment of the plastic industry going towards creating biodegradable plastics. And to me, that's where the sweet spot is.
That's the future. There's a company called Algenesis that has created a surfboard that is completely biodegradable.
Yeah.
And I think that technology is really interesting, where they're looking to accelerate it. I think they can get plastics that now are decomposing within 3 weeks. So accelerated decomposition, which is what we need, because if we have to wait several months or years at the rate we're producing and growing, it's still not going to really have the impact we want. It's definitely going to be a step forward. But that technology is really exciting, because we're hooked on plastics, and it's going to be very hard to get away from them, but easier to incorporate regeneration and decomposability into the plastics. And I like that you're really approaching the entire life cycle of sustainability rather than the single act of the product. One irony to me is everyone talks about EVs, electric vehicles, being so sustainable, but as long as we're getting 60% of our electricity from coal, it doesn't really matter, right? Yeah. We're getting it from the same source. So that to me is a smart way of doing a complete accounting, really from the beginning to the end, and not focusing on very small marketing and PR wins.
Yeah, and there's a lot you can do around the biodegradable part. I mean, you can make things that are actually, become fertilizer or something. They become that afterlife is something in the biodegradable world that benefits us.
Yeah.
I've even thought at one time I had playing around with a idea of a shoe that had a beanbag sole on it, which Nike has recently come out with the shoes with little plastic beads. I never intended that to be plastic beads. It was supposed to be, I was looking at flax seeds and other things that would go in there. But then you could create something that, you just plant in the garden and it grows into some kind of, whatever.
We could literally be eating our shoes.
Yeah.
It's the next step.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how practical that is, but I mean, it's fun. It was fun to explore that.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot going on with bioreactors that are also very exciting. We could be powering our plants with the recycled goods that they produce. And that kind of full cycle regeneration, I think, is what we all need to be looking towards. And we also need to be honest about where we're not measuring up. Recyclability or getting to a second life is not the same as completely regenerative.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it would be great if we actually had, a material. Maybe the plastic industry can get there at some point where, I guess it'd be like glass. It used to be pop bottles were all glass, and they went back and they ground them up and made more glass out of it. And there was no glasses like, it can be recycled, and I think like 100%. I think there's no, there used to be that they'd actually just wash the bottles and they'd fill them with pop again. And some of the bottles in the case were like all chipped, all scratched up and stuff because they were just refilled. Some of the bottles I remember that was part of the process too. But to me, that's the kind of material, you need to have in the plastics world where it can come back and 100% of it goes back in, and it can be a continuous loop. It's not just a one-time deal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's an interesting kind of market for this because it's more than just the materials that you as a designer developer put into your product. You need a ecosystem of suppliers and the entire supply chain to be able to take those, renew it, and sell it back to factories with demand. And this is where we've really lost. I mean, China, until they banned it, I think it was last year, they were buying 75% of our recycling and reusing it in their factories. Now that we don't have that supply, the pricing for recycling has plummeted, and we're in a very bad place for even current recycling. Most people would be surprised to know that most of what they recycle goes to the landfill anyway, right?
Yeah.
Not really being reclaimed because we don't have a demand market built for that yet.
Yeah.
Building that kind of demand, products that you're making exclusively from recycled material is a big part of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well,
and I think it's possible that we'll get to, but there's got to be a focus on that. That's what I mean. These companies are drinking their own Kool-Aid and thinking they're sustainable, and they're just looking for sort of band-aids and excuses rather than really going after answers. I think that hopefully that, and people think of sustainability, this recycle thing, there should be more like it's saying biodegradable or saying 100% renewable or whatever, not this blanket of recyclable, and then people just manipulating it to make it, even like the Nike regrind they were using for a while. They're regrinding the rubber, the bottom of the shoe, and taking it and putting it in horse stalls.
Yeah,
it's like that. And that, though they're not taking that material out of the horse stalls and reusing it, it just goes into the back landfill behind the barn, and all that gets into the stream. Because there's just runoff from there going right into the streams, and so that's not really recyclable at all. That's just like, it's worse than taking it, I think, and putting it into a controlled environment where it prevents it from getting into the streams.
Yeah, you're spreading it out and increasing the exposure to the environment.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is something, I mean, every company needs to take responsibility for how its products are being reused or recycled. That's my thinking. When we started making our shoes, we were thinking of full regenerative, but we can't get there yet. We talked about a little bit of the market and the reasons why, but while we're pursuing that in the short term, it's the minimum that we can do is to find partners that will take our used goods and reuse them in ways that aren't hurting the environment, be they melting them down and using injection molding for, dental hardware, or reusing the leather scraps for furniture.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know we're getting to a little bit of time here, Mike, but what would you like to kind of close out with when it comes to what you see in the industry and your work with some of the footwear brands you're still developing, you're still creating new product lines. What do you see as the future in the next 10 years for footwear?
Well, what I try to focus on and what I teach in my classes is something more about the health aspects of, because I keep trying to evolve. You see behind me the lasts on the wall, and I keep trying to create a last that's a little more, basically it's going back towards what is the natural shape of the foot.
Yeah.
Allowing for, and then I design things around allowing for more natural movement, and trying to make things healthier in that respect. I'm not really focused on, although I do some weaving and things like that, but I'm not really highly focused on the sustainability aspect. I would like to, I'm curious about like the mushroom leather and stuff like that. If I can get my hands on, I'm always looking for things like that I can get my hands on and start, in putting those into the process.
Yeah. I know a mushroom leather guy, but it's not the leather itself isn't there yet. the quality isn't nearly what it needs to be dynamic on a foot for a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
In and out.
Yeah. I've seen that too. I've seen samples of it, but I think it's at least a start, and I think I think it has a possibility of getting there.
Yeah.
And there's other things out there that are similar, other approaches. And so that my main thing is the passing on to students. For me, it's teaching it for the future, and teaching what I've learned, and teach especially around the health aspects. A lot of designers don't really pay attention to how their shoes affect the feet of their customers.
Yeah.
It's more about just the aesthetic, design and making it look pretty. But
do you think we'll get away from the last? Will we be able to finally is that a crutch that's preventing us from fully embracing the foot as an intermediary form?
That's part of it, but I have quite a few different styles of footwear that I create that I teach. What I call it basically the moccasin design, that don't use a last, because a lot of people I'm trying to teach, especially now that I'm trying to teach more online, they don't have last, and I'm over a long distance, so I show them that I have about 3 or 4 different techniques of making a shoe without a last. And so I'm showing them those techniques, and they can make something right at home, just with a basic sewing machine. They can stitch things up real quickly, and sometimes I send them patterns to help them get started. But there's a lot you can do without a last. In fact, when I was at Nike, I asked them once. I said, how much does it cost for this last to move through the production process? And I think it would be a really simple thing to figure out, basic physics. You have this thing that weighs this certain amount, and how much energy does it take to move it from point A to point B? They're heavy. Lasts are heavy. The form you build a shoe on, these more plastic forms behind me, they're heavy. And so if you look at, thousands of those going through the factory every day, tens of thousands in some cases, they all have a cost energy-wise. And I thought, well, why don't we just make them out of lightweight foam? And in some shoes you could do that. Not every shoe, but some shoes you could do that. And how much energy savings would that equal? But nobody wants to figure that out. And all the equations of cost, nobody wants to figure out how much energy savings it would be.
Well, it sounds like there are other costs associated with using a last, more than just the creation of the last or the movement of the last in the factory. Lasts are made by, talk about craft, talk about artisanship, someone who really understands the volume of a foot and freezes in time to create a volume measurement for a foot and every shoe that's produced off of that. And as we mass manufacture these, I wonder if that artistry and craft is being lost. If you're making 1,000 lasts to scale production, what are you losing rather than having a single craftsman make that last out of wood while looking at the foot?
Well, that's not practical in a production setting, but and they still do that in an individual. There's companies that do that when they custom make shoes, but more in Europe than here in the States. But and the last is not truly the shape. There's things you have to do to make it different than the shape of the foot. That take hours to explain, but so it's not one-to-one. You can't, if you make something exactly the shape of your foot and build a shoe on it, you couldn't even walk in it. I mean, your toes.
Well, that's the element of the craft that it requires. And I think this is the fusion you're talking about that we began this conversation with around the craft and technology. That exact fusion can be found when you're talking about the size and fit and overall make of the shoe. And just as a heart surgeon can use new technology to steer where he goes and how, but still an understanding intuitive of the body to make incisions and perform surgery, a craftsman that's making a last can use a digital scan of the foot, but still use that to, I think, more effectively or more quickly scale what is a digital last essentially.
Well, the problem with that with last makers that at least my experience, is that, again, you're making a static form for a dynamic piece of the anatomy.
Yeah,
it doesn't
always do something.
Yeah, and they're putting a lot of the primary influence on a last is fashion.
The toe shape, the heel height.
how much the toe shape, making it pointed,
Yeah.
all kinds of things go into it that are really detrimental to the health of the foot. So that's I haven't met a last maker yet that's really focused on, the biomechanics and that making, and even talking to doctors and learning, and looking at the foot, how it moves dynamically and building a last based on that. I explore it, but I haven't found any kindred spirit, I guess, in the last world that's doing that.
I've got someone you should talk to, but I think you all know each other, because that's the beautiful thing about the kind of world that you're in the industry is there's a small amount of very devoted people who really know what they're doing when it comes to either last making or footwear development. I mean, I know they all know your name, that's for sure.